dark waters. Writer Vitaly Winter. After the freighter arrived in orbit around Europa, they were kicked into the hold of an old orbital shuttle, where a variety of anti-G seats had been installed. Everything had been hastily and haphazardly refitted. The new owners learned quickly and used what was at hand. Everything left over from the old owners, and even themselves, were put to use. Humanity über alles. No offense. On the far bulkhead, a dented screen fluttered with color images, carelessly and crookedly attached with gray army-grade tape. There are no seasons in space. No spring, no summer, no fall. Only winter. Eternal winter and melancholy on these little balls of frozen hydrogen and mud where they were brought. There's no specific time here either, only a dark, silent infinity all around. The time scale, like the temperature, depends only on you, or rather on your meager capabilities. Get used to it, or you'll die. The sun had just risen in this part of Europe. The screen showed, with its jagged pixels flickering, its small, jagged disk hovering just above the edge of the plain to the east. Above it hung the enormous, narrow crescent of Jupiter, emitting a dirty yellow light, so that on the icy plain below, striated with ridges and crevices, each protrusion cast a strange double shadow. Annika turned to Jack and said in a deliberately loud voice in interlingua, "Our ship is called San Sebastian, right?" Her partner nodded back at her, uncomprehending, and glanced warily at the Marine at the airlock. "What a coincidence. I had a book about a ship like that when I was a kid, and it had a ship like that, the San Sebastian," she continued, her voice rising. "Well, you know, pirates, the Caribbean, and slave traders on that San Sebastian. Can you imagine what a coincidence? Who would have thought something like that could happen even today?"
Her words struck home. The face invisible behind the helmet's visor turned in their direction. Annika smiled charmingly and gave the Marine the finger. She, and all of them, had been shown their place in the new world, even if he knew his own. The paratrooper reached for his seatbelt buckles, but his movement was interrupted by a short blare of the siren, signaling a sharp orbital maneuver before landing, but he responded anyway. The short man lifted his helmet visor, grinned, and spat in their direction. It was a terrible insult in zero gravity, and he knew it, just as he knew they couldn't respond. Her partner looked at her with displeasure. "Feel better?" She stubbornly shook her head, trying to push away the convulsing thought that they were now hashar, just goods and meat for sale. The shuttle began to perform orbital maneuvers, and she fell into a deep unconsciousness, from which she was brought out by her previously silent partner, who whispered in her ear, "We need to watch and remember everything we see upon landing. Don't switch off." A pang of irritation shot through her. She remembered everything perfectly well, and what they were interested in was deep down beneath the ice. Although, more than likely, all this was useless. It was now morning where they landed, maybe a couple of hours after sunrise. A day on Europa lasts 85 hours, and its orbit around Jupiter takes exactly the same amount of time. Jupiter was no longer visible, but from here it was 30 times larger than Earth's moon. They were landing directly in the Puil crater. The landing went almost unnoticed, and then they were herded into the airlock, where they were given a variety of spacesuits. She crawled, somehow, into an old, slightly too small spacesuit with its yellow anti-radiation coating peeling in places. Then, like everyone else, she walked to the transparent passageway.
In the sky, directly above their heads, Jupiter was already full, and all three of its Galilean moons glowed nearby. A featureless dot of the sun hung near Jupiter's lower edge, and all around was a frighteningly quiet semi-darkness, dotted with monstrously large decorations. As her eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness, Annika could discern a storm on the gigantic planet's black disk, as if strung with a tangle of small currents enveloping the vortex. This storm had originated before humanity had invented the wheel, and it was larger than the satellite they had just landed on. Her tired and devastated consciousness stirred, uttering a grim thought. Everything in this life is vanity. Europa's crust, like Io's, was constantly eroded by heat generated by the ocean's tides, driven by the planet's rotation around Jupiter. Meanwhile, the heat of Europa's underwater volcanoes kept the ocean from freezing and stirred up powerful currents from the sea floor. The St. Bledewith cluster stood above a site where a gigantic upwelling of a warm current had reduced the ice crust to a thickness of just a few dozen kilometers. Furthermore, the area contained breccia, a stable structure with minimal ice movement. Furthermore, the upwelling currents not only eroded the ice, they also stirred up minerals from the ocean floor, essential for gardens. That's why the farm operated there. She didn't notice anything remarkable from the outside. Several clusters of seemingly abandoned buildings on stilts at the edges of the airfield, some standard fuel storage tanks, and the ice field of the port, pockmarked with black spots of jet exhaust, through which the titanium mesh of the sealing system gleamed dully. Beyond, a crater stretched out in the semi-darkness, dotted with sharp teeth in the glow of methane flares.
The methane apparently rose with hydrothermal waters, accumulating beneath the ice crust and occasionally threatening to cause new cracks. So the farmers vented the excess to the surface. They were quickly herded into the mouth of a transport tunnel, from which a long conveyor belt for cargo was just beginning to emerge. It was already piled high with enormous briquettes containing something protein-like, judging by the labeling. At the last moment, she turned around, looking up at the sky. Who knew if she'd ever see it again? The eye of Jupiter hung directly above them. They say if you watch a storm long enough, you can see its slow movement. But she didn't have time. Not at all. They'd been driven for a good hour, urged on by electric shocks, deeper and deeper through a maze of old tunnels, coated in a thick layer of frost from the breath of those who had gone before them. Now it was as vacuum as the surface. Here and there the tunnel passed through areas without lining, revealing the glacier's mother body, and the glare of the flashlights cast eerie shadows across the ancient, dark body of the ice. When their arms and legs were completely numb from the cold, they saw the gates of the airlock, above which someone had welded carefully carved letters from oxidized copper. Many demons lurk in the forests and waters, in the wilderness and in the dark recesses of our souls. Martin Luther. As with each of the Belt colonies, here too, they apparently tried, to the best of their ability and desire, to introduce an element of an earthly name into the life and culture of the colony. In this case, a Welsh deity. In her world on Pallas, they lived with a slight touch of Greek culture. They lived. The sparse scattering of old mining colonies on the rocks of the Belt was the first to come under attack. Now, it seems, it's the turn of the old colonies on the Galilean moons.
A united humanity, a united power. The mother planet has decided to lay claim to its wayward great-grandchildren. It's all so familiar and so predictable. It's normal. Perhaps even worse has happened in history. But how sad it is to lose your little world, built by generations of ancestors, just because the vector of human development has shifted slightly. They lost again. Some fled, some were killed, or carried off by lasso like slaves. Tears welled up in her eyes. Beyond the lock gates, they were lined up in a small square. The giant gates slammed shut. They were allowed to remove their spacesuits, and Annika was immediately struck by the bright, intoxicating scent of daffodils, like a blow to the face. Somehow, controlling her dizziness, she noticed the locals clustered at the edges of the square. All were tall, but not as tall as the Hashar brought in from Palace. They were dark-haired, swathed in black robes that concealed their figures, and pale, as if the ice around them had eaten into them over generations of living here. Suddenly, a child's voice came from behind her, asking in interlingua,
"The skeletons have arrived. Why are there so many of them, Tante?"
A red-haired girl, about 5 years old by the standard age scale, asked, impatiently tugging at the hand of a tall, thin woman in a robe standing next to her.
"They're having a war there,"
the nanny answered quietly, without intonation.
"Bloderweth will be pleased."
The little girl smiled cheerfully, and tearing her hand from the woman's palm, she jumped high, reaching almost to the low ceiling.
"Nula, watch your tongue in front of strangers."
The girl was quickly led away to the side streets. The woman said sternly, catching the redhead. Shouts rang out. The Marines, still wearing their combat suits, began dividing them into groups, handing out kicks along the way.
An old man with a gray beard emerged from the crowd of locals, who had been watching them silently and seemingly indifferently, and, raising his hand, began to speak. He gestured toward the group and nodded to the Marine lieutenant. "To the plantations. If you want to join the colony, prove you can work down in the fields. The rest of you should go into the mines to drill new tunnels for the fields." "But we didn't work down there, only in space." She raised her hand unexpectedly. One of the previously unnoticed guards immediately rushed toward her, and her body shuddered as the shock of a stun gun pierced her tired muscles. "Pendragor Uther has given clear orders regarding all new arrivals," someone invisible hissed in pain right in her ear. "He who works eats. Don't worry. It's as dark and quiet down there as it was up there. You'll like it." After another hour of wandering through dark, cold tunnels, they arrived at a long, dead-end spur with several dozen similar but short rooms branching out like branches. This was their new home, long abandoned and empty. As one of the locals accompanying the Marines, wearing a long toga that swirled strangely in the low gravity, told them, "This is your new home. It's almost on the beach. Relax and get settled in. Tomorrow we'll come to you and show you your work." As he was turning to leave, someone from the far corner asked in a muffled voice, "And will they feed us?" At the Abbey of St. Bloderweth, there are strict rules. Whoever doesn't work doesn't eat, and you're useless for now. Amidst a deathly silence, he turned, swaying like a living sack, the folds of his dirty gray toga, and disappeared behind a bristling line of Marines. Then, in complete silence, the heavy airlock door creaked on its unlubricated hinges, and they were left alone in the dimly lit dead end of the residential section. Everyone grumbled and began to disperse to their cells.
They had no strength left, so she and Jack floated, still getting used to the unfamiliar gravity, into one of the dimly lit cells. At least the smell of daffodils wasn't as strong here, and she sighed with relief. Her head had finally stopped aching. The air in the barracks was damp, quickly becoming chilly, and there was also a strange smell of salt from the nearby ocean. It was a hard world, different. It would be hard to fit into, and even harder to leave. She looked around the living quarters, apparently long abandoned, but still heated. It was a forgotten world, abandoned, yet alive. Bunches of leaks protruded from every crack in the paneling, and, as everywhere else,
The faint but still nauseatingly intoxicating scent of daffodils hung around. All around were the greenery of oxygen-producing plants climbing the walls, and simple, worn furniture made of over-dried rock or gray, dried seaweed. The sparse interior seemed to emerge from the greenery. A sharp smell of iodine, mixed with a cloying dampness, wafted from the piled-up mattresses. She immediately fell onto the creaking, rusty bed and closed her eyes, trying to shut out what was happening. "We're far from the first ones here," Jack interrupted her siesta, pointing to the half-erased scribbles on the peeling, water-streaked far wall. Someone had scratched a jagged line of symbols into the damp, bubbling insulation board. "What is written there?" "I don't know. It's in Arabic, I think." He poked at the wall with his finger. "It's made from some kind of crushed plants. Made from seaweed. Everything here is made from it. And I'm willing to bet the food here is made from it too. Are you angry again? Remember, we're just a bunch of people. We need to survive. And complete the task."
Just survive. He waved his hand wearily.
"We're probably not the first group." He nodded wearily at the sign on the ceiling. "If we don't cope, they'll send more, and so on until the locals surrender, or are overthrown, or come under external control. They're unlikely to like our example. The shorties could have simply taken them by storm and internal sabotage like they did to us. Maybe this time they want the fruit to fall into their hands." They huddled close, wrapped in damp, strange-smelling blankets made of the same dried seaweed. Sleep came quickly, but brought no relief. It wasn't even a dream. More like the last memories of a home she would never see again. After all, she no longer had a home. Others had taken it. It all happened as it had so many times before. Mutual hatred and contempt were nurtured for decades, and eventually it all degenerated into racial segregation. First, mutual contacts began to diminish. Flights began to fly. Visas became increasingly problematic. And very soon, the flows dwindled, becoming rare streams of contraband and embassy missions. Everything that happened on either side became shrouded in mutually terrifying fables. And then came the war, which ended quickly. One side simply wasn't ready for everything. Suddenly, after a week in a cell with other prisoners, she was dragged off for interrogation. In the devastated security service cluster of the Palada Republic, scarred by shrapnel and soft bullets, she was dragged there by two Marines, short by Astor standards, but looking like square, silent machines in their armored suits. A platinum blonde with sharp cheekbones sat at an empty table, clearly brought from an Earth ship on a chair. Her indifferent blue eyes bored into Annika. She was being assessed like a commodity, or rather, a mechanism that could generate profit. "We want to offer you a job. Not here."
The colonists there are funny people, like hermit cultists. It's a quiet place, but they take in refugees too. An algae farm. You and your partner will like it. She bared her teeth, though it was probably meant to be a smile. "We need information. He'll go with you." A transparent file with a faded image and a short biography flew towards her, tumbling slowly. "You have more experience. After all, you worked in the local security service of the Palada Republic." She bared her teeth again. "You know how to analyze information. Work. Get used to it. Listen. And when the next embassy arrives, they'll take you. They'll say they made a mistake, and we need you." If she emphasized that if you work hard, you'll get citizenship, Limited, of course, but it's something. The former junior security officer glanced at the worn tablet. A thin, haggard face, eyes sunken with hopelessness. She'd seen him somewhere, but that wasn't surprising. Everyone on Pallas had seen each other at some point, or were distant relatives or acquaintances of acquaintances. The 6 handshake rule wasn't necessary here. 1 would probably do. The scent of fear pierced the screen. A loser, just like her. An orbital pilot who, like her, had been hooked. Everyone wanted to live. But working for the occupying forces was worse than death, except they were already dead. Morality was no longer relevant here. Their world was lost. How can a person live if everything around them is dead? She nodded uncertainly. Excellent choice. The woman across from me flashed her wicked smile again. Annika's former comrade. Any other questions? What should we look for? You will understand, believe me. In the morning, they were awakened by the blaring of an emergency siren, and dozens of taciturn, pale farmers were waiting for them as they rushed out into the corridor.
The Marines had disappeared, but there were enough guards even without them. The bottom, or as they called it here, the shore, turned out to be quite close to their home. After several dozen short, sloping tunnels leading downwards, they reached their work site. They were quickly divided into groups and given old wetsuits. Annika received an armful of rubber suits and thermal underwear yellowed with age, with a helmet skillfully painted with white flowers crowning the entire mountain. Coincidences are so non-coincidental. She remembered her old helmet, covered in a shroud of scratches, on the old spacesuit that had disappeared on Pallas, and stroked the lily tattoos on her wrist. Soon they were dressed and sitting in a room next to a huge hole with metal steps, cranes, and conveyor belts set into the ice, descending into the dark water. The locals wore similar wetsuits, but with phosphorescent arm and leg bandages. Workers scurried everywhere, lots of them, and most of them were just like them. The water embraced her indifferently, and then the cold taste of half-frozen, sulfurous and strangely salty water hit her throat. Europa's ocean waters were about -10 degrees Celsius. However, the freezing point was shifted by the high salt content, and the water beneath the crystal-clear skies was semi-frozen, like punch or thick grease. True, in places, vertical currents, such as those from hydrothermal vents here, carried relatively warm water to the icy crust. A farm was built in this gap, eroded by warm waters like a canyon, where water from black smokers on the sea floor eroded the icy crust and spread across its surface like warm lava. She'd assumed it was a large enterprise, but the gardens were at least enormous. Lights were on as far as she could see, and Annika could see endless masts of algae, dozens, hundreds of plantations stretching off into the distance in all directions, gathered in blocks marked with colorful floats. An endless forest of masts, frozen into the ice sheet of the icy skies above, receded into the darkness, pierced by the beams of the lanterns. Algae curled around the masts and ropes attached to the racks. Translucent ribbons, sparkling green or crimson in the dim light, swayed in the warm current like a single living organism. Mature algae reached several hundred meters in length and developed under the pressure of the current like someone's unkempt curly hair. A fog hung around, presumably molecular sulfur, released by the algae as they metabolized carbon. Beneath Europa's kilometer-thick shell, there was no light other than that created by the humans who had penetrated it. The algae growing there were chemolithotrophs, using inorganic compounds containing nitrogen, sulfur, or iron to convert carbon dioxide into glucose. There were also hosts of organisms living on the bottom in warm zones, similar to deep-sea life on Earth. Their genetic code was similar,
and they apparently originated from the same source, but their paths diverged long ago. Nothing more complex than algae and benthic crab colonies ever arose on Europa. At least, nothing more advanced has yet been discovered. However, the local colonies had long since become self-sufficient. Annika's thin beam from her flashlight drew strange patterns on the ice's surface, sparkling and confusing distance measurements. It was difficult to determine up and down. The ancient landscape of Europa's subglacial world was mesmerizing. The icy skies, illuminated by the narrow beam, sparkled and stretched off into the distance like a pitted plain.
In the fissures away from the hot breath of the current, gullies and dark cracks became visible, dotted with patches of brown and black ice, driven by vertical currents that swept minerals from the seabed. It's hard to believe that the ice above your head is 10 kilometers thick. They sailed through a canyon dotted with algae farms between two crystal-clear ice mountains, Jack following behind, followed by one of the group of miner-like kumpels tasked with training them. The canyon was polished by the current, like a piece of sparkling diamond. After half an hour of training maneuvers between the masts, where brownish-purple algae fronds bristled like living creatures, and around which swarmed schools of barely visible plankton and translucent, strange fish, they began to feel more confident in the water. It's time to get to work. The locals were celebrating St. David's Day, a holiday celebrated on March 1st in Wales. And for the first time since their arrival, they were invited upstairs to the main hall. A strange girl with a fringe of red hair appeared in the crowd, just as she had on the day of their arrival. Suddenly, the girl noticed the lily tattoos on her arms, which suited her fair, almost transparent skin so well. "You'll be a good bloodweed. You like it," she sang in a thin voice. "You'll never see the light of day again, and all the birds will hate you, and beat you, and peck you if they find you. And you won't lose your name, but will always be called Bloodweed from now on." "Nula, don't bother the new ones." The nanny pulled her away again. "The girl is so strange, just like the people around her. It makes my knees tremble. There's something about them." "Something bad," Jack said quietly. She shrugged, busy chewing the strange black pie. "Did you know that the settlement used to have a different name?"
No. It was called New Virginia, after the first American colony. One of the first pearls of the outlying settlements. I don't understand why it happened this way.
Why what? You think too much. It's harmful in our situation. Some kind of mass was taking place in the central square. They didn't understand the words chanted by the crowd in unison, but they were well fed. A mournful chant replaced the prayers and began to sound like thunder rumbled beneath the low vault of a cave. Goosebumps. I didn't think that sects were still possible in the 23rd century. After a pause, she replied, "Everyone here has a past. It's probably interesting and instructive, but it's best not to talk about it out loud. The past, Kumpo, can often kill more than the dark waters and fog from the tunnels of abandoned cities." From behind the column, the leader of a group of miners stationed near the ones they worked in the adjacent fields responded in a cracked voice. These guys were a close-knit group. They were their own. The leader's forehead was scarred with the typical miner scars. Working on distant asteroids for years, they often suffered from cancer caused by radiation from the inadequate shielding of their temporary colonies. "Where are you guys from?" "We? From everywhere. Nomadic mining colonies. Ever heard of those?" "The base was on Rock 19916, and that's where we were picked up during a shipment of rare earth alloys." "How long have you been here?" "People don't live here for long. Think about it and look around." He said something to the other in Pidgin Russian, their native language,
and then nodded and moved to the passage, blocking their view. Aren't you afraid to tell us this?
You? Who? We're on our own here, and no one cares about us. For now, we're working. The main thing is to ship the harvest up there on time. Just think, the farm supplies a huge amount of carbon compounds, glycogen, cellulose, starches. It supplies almost all the mines and settlements in this region of space. It also supplies a huge amount of protein. But we don't produce it. No one here has ever seen such quantities. Where does it come from? You've been here longer. So, where from? Stick with us and don't blab. The plantations here are ancient. No one can tell how old they are anymore, and they've always been inhabited. Well, you know, as often happens here. What they did here, what they found, nobody knows. We only have guesses ourselves, but you won't like them. They disappear here in whole blocks. That's what they say. An accident, and that's it. They disappear along with the fog, engulfing section after section, tunnel after tunnel, leaving behind silence. Dead and silent. What's happening, no one knows. Of the living, we're waiting for the embassy. They'll take us away. We're here by mistake. Jack said, staring stubbornly ahead and chewing a bitter piece of black bread. There was an embassy, but it disappeared. You haven't heard about it? It flew away or something. Nobody knows anything. I understand. We couldn't reach an agreement then. It doesn't matter to us. We need to get out of here. The time has come. He looked into her eyes. Yes, this is not our war. Not ours anymore. You understand the gist of what's going on correctly, sister, he said, drawing a diagram in the air. There are different kinds of distant places. There are many abandoned buildings here and much to be found. There used to be tunnels connecting the colony with other similar subglacial cities, but after the dead fog appeared, they were blocked up. We'll meet after shifts in this distant rift. There's a pocket there, further along the old tunnel. It should lead to the old colony in the neighboring breccia. We'll try to break through. We're experts at this, after all. They don't like uninvited guests here. We hope the owners are long gone. A new home wouldn't hurt us now. Why us? Why not? You're just like us. An extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt. They hurriedly drank, burning their lips, a brew made from the flowers of a genetically modified meadowsweet, a cold, hardy, and moisture-loving plant that grew wild here and there in the walls, supplementing their meager rations. The drink had a strangely sweet taste and a honeyed aroma. The young shoots and roots could also be eaten, which is what they did. Do you really like it here? She sat down on the rusty bed with creaking springs. No, of course not. I guess I've been in the dark too long. Something inside me has snapped. I long for a foothold, but there. My partner nodded at the gray ceiling, covered in wet streaks. I can't find it anymore. Up there, we lived on the shores of endless night, on the edge of an eternal starry sea of darkness. And right here beneath my feet is a dark, abyssal ocean. It makes me feel uneasy somehow. We'll leave with the miners, and then everything will be clear. We'll get out somehow. He nodded silently, not taking his absent gaze from the hieroglyphs of wet stains that littered the ceiling. What do you think about the colony? They're strange, different. Although for those shorty earthlings, we're even more so.
He hesitated, searching for the word exotic. We're more exotic than these people here. After all, we, who grew up on the rocks, have long been called a parallel species. They don't pity us any more than they do these strange subglacial settlers. To those shorty people, They look at least almost the same as them. We're different. That's why they're all afraid of us, secretly envious that we took the first step before them. It's the same with the locals. We don't understand them." He hesitated again, searching for something to say. "And it's not necessary. They took a step too, but to the side, I think. The stories about this place are pure nonsense, of course, but now I'm starting to doubt it too. Sometimes." He seemed to cross the threshold and begin to speak haltingly, as if afraid he wouldn't have time. "I found an old book here, or rather, a few pages. Someone hid it under a layer of insulation. Welsh history. Myths. Listen. Llew Llaw Gyffes was cursed 3 times by his mother, Arianrhod. The last curse was that he would never find a human wife. King Math and Llew's uncle Gwydion created Blodeuwedd from flowers, and she became Llew's wife. The god Pwyll is the lord of the underworld. He helps people adapt to new situations, can exorcise evil spirits, and aids in friendship and love. With his help, one can see prophetic dreams. He was summoned by incantations. Belief in the transmigration of souls played a central role in mythology, reducing the fear of death and supporting courage and selflessness during wars. In the most difficult life situations, such as war, illness, or other dangers, human sacrifices were also made. They were silent for a moment, and Jack asked quietly, "What do you think?" "You were..." She quickly raised her finger to her mouth and gestured around her. He immediately fell silent. Who knows if they're listening, but it doesn't hurt to be careful. "The same system of social history," Annika began cautiously, whispering. "Just like with us. Turn off the lights and scary stories will appear. Only, of course, they look like short people, you noticed correctly, but there's darkness in their heads. They make me feel uneasy too. We both know the price of the deal and the risk of breaking it. We signed up for this job ourselves. Nobody will do anything. Who are we?" "You know, they bury their dead at sea," Jack said quietly. "They just drop them in the equatorial downdraft, and they float into the dark abyss. At least we're similar in that." He'd completely broken down. Completely. So that's where his breakdown lay. Those on that transport who wanted to leave, and almost all of them died after their engine was holed. And Jack drifted for months among corpses and broken, depressurized sections until the ship's new owners took over. He died then, and he buried himself. He tried to dig up that grave, but apparently couldn't. He gave up. They received the signal from the miners during the next shift. Today, she broke out in a sweat. They hadn't had time to prepare, to think everything through. A minute later, she calmed down. Whatever would be, would be. They left in pairs so as not to arouse the suspicion of the guards who occasionally appeared. There were surprisingly few of them today.
He and Jack were the last to leave. There was still plenty of air, and the old tunnels, according to their accomplices, still had their own atmosphere. Then they would have to traverse dozens, if not hundreds of kilometers of old transport tunnels, hoping only for luck. There was nowhere to turn back. They wouldn't be allowed in here, and no one on the surface wanted them anyway. Suddenly, something flashed behind them, dousing them with a stream of water, and small hands pulled her into the dark depths. Annika screamed, losing her mouthpiece and swallowing the stinging, salty, cold water. Thin fingers dug into her legs and then released them. Someone shook her, and she saw Jack's spotted helmet before her. He shoved the lost mouthpiece into her mouth, and then it seemed as if someone yanked it down into the depths. In the flashlight's light,
she saw a tangle of shadows at the very edge of the rift. Then a chemical torch flared up, momentarily illuminating Jack's helmet and the hand holding the torch. Everything else was in the grip of the gray mass entangling him. Then there was an explosion. Jack had detonated his tanks. She was saved only by her reflexes, which had kicked in a second earlier. Annika had jumped back behind the wall and remained alive, while the broken-off piece of ice took the brunt of the blast wave. Dazed and disoriented, she swam for a long time, lost in her tracks, until she stopped in horror, stumbling upon a huge lump of writhing flesh, swaying with the current on one of the masts stretching into the darkness. Something stirred deep within the sphere, and Annika recoiled with a scream. There was a human figure there, red, with exposed organs, lifeless. Not all were dead. Some enormous lumps of slime shifted strangely, as if the person inside them were beginning to merge with the surrounding substance. Swimming further, she hovered among similar, slowly shifting spheres.
Further on, stretching into the darkness, hung rows of similar buds, but they seemed to have opened their petals, releasing the young within into the dark waters. This is where these hundreds of tons of strange protein come from. Living bodies, like seedlings for underwater gardens. Some kind of experiment. The changing seasonal currents apparently bring plankton, which devours the human bait. This is where they harvest it. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the blood was pounding in her temples like a hammer. She swam away as fast as she could. She only came to when she surfaced in a crack with a pocket of air. Annika lit the penultimate flare, and it reluctantly floated upward. It became clear that the chamber was twice as spacious as their farm's dock. Such chambers were common in the lower reaches of the ice sheet, opening up during high tides. The floor was littered with ice chunks that had fallen from the high ceiling. She cautiously surfaced and, looking around, climbed out along the slippery tongue of ice above the water. Tunnels opened here too. There were people here. Annika allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. Taking off her suit and mask, pulling out a hidden flashlight, and pulling the collar of her sweat-dampened jumper over her frozen face, she set off into the darkness of the passage. Every step, or rather every push before him, echoed loudly beneath the low vaults of the tunnel. The entire floor, once lined with mats of dried seaweed, was now covered in a thick carpet of hoarfrost crystals that glittered like diamonds in the lantern light. The walls around him were made of ancient, dark ice, flecked with brown sulfite deposits that still bore the furrows left by the machines that had bought them, casting vague shadows in the light of their lanterns.
It seemed as if someone was peering intently at him from within the ice, and a queasy feeling of being watched gnawed at his consciousness from within, causing him to shudder at every wheeze of the groaning, tunnel-eaten ice breccia. Aside from the occasional red, frost-encrusted slabs measuring the ice's subsidence, everything down here was gray, cold, and ancient ice. The side tunnels, twisting, went deep into the ice field, running parallel to the beach at the very surface. She stopped. Something was wrong. Then it dawned on her. There were no other tracks. She surfaced in the wrong cave. Now we need to look for the others. They can't be far away. But something else was wrong. She felt it, tensed, not yet understanding what was happening, and her body was already covered in sweat. Endorphins and adrenaline rushed through her bloodstream, pumping her muscles, and her reactions soared to the max. A strangely salty smell of seawater wafted from the darkness of the tunnel, but it was overpowered by a cloying, metallic aftertaste. The smell of fresh death. Someone had died up there. The next cave was around the next bend. Annika looked around cautiously.
The flashlight's thin beam traced an arc across the dark ice of the walls, disappearing into the darkness of yet another bay. And then the scent of blood hit her nostrils, and a complimentary taste of sea salt appeared on her lips, seeming so out of place here, with a couple dozen kilometers of ice hanging overhead. The flashlight's pupils caught the reflection. She froze, tense, unable to breathe, staring at the dying man. The enormous body had been torn apart by the explosion, and the water flowing down the icy tongue where the creature had died was streaked with red. She was wrong. Plankton had been created by humans, or at least had a hand in altering it. But something had gone wrong, as it always does. The creature stared at her with its blind eyes.
The dying, altered thing, as if awakening, swayed, trying to rise. On either side of its bloated face, still resembling a human one, a tuft of short, unformed whiskers quivered. The new Homo europaeus must be able to use echolocation. They had gained much, but they had also lost a great deal. A multitude of questions flashed through my mind. How do they feed? Do they pump sulfide-rich water through their guts, where symbiotic bacteria live to metabolize the carbon? Annika shuddered and recoiled against the ice wall. His kind splashed in the darkness of the bay, and dozens of reflections from dead eyes glinted. She understood the religion of the cloister. Old legends fell on fertile ground in a degraded, closed society. The reapers come when the warm current changes course. They migrate. They visit their relatives. Only every encounter is the last for those caught. But they've adapted and learned to learn from it, to give up the unwanted. How do they live there in the depths, without light, stars, air? The skies for them have become the crystalline ice shell of Europe, and those who live there are strange creatures, almost gods. Was their salvation in oblivion? She didn't know what to think. Now, floating nearby are those like her, hiding from the old world that had overtaken them. Vanished, but not surrendered. When eyes are directed toward the stars across the dark abyss of space, what can they reflect? Greed, rage, and malice. When eyes gaze into the dark abyss, covered by an icy shell glittering with diamond reflections, what do they see? Perhaps they're wrong, many would say so, because even for her, such a radical change to their genome and body is beyond comprehension. They lost their old world, their bodies, but perhaps they gained something much greater in return. An entire world just for them, and freedom from the shackles of prejudice that had shackled them all.
It's not for her to decide what's right in this mortal world of illusions. Let there remain hope that at least someone was able to find peace and live by their own rules. Who is she to judge them? Annika recalled the colonists' looks. Probably everyone who remained was either scared or didn't fit in for the crossing. She recalled the farm leader's icy gaze and suddenly realized he could have, but he didn't. All of them scared. There was no right or wrong here. They were all victims. Victims of a changed world, another war, and human arrogance. Behind her, in the tunnel flickering with the reflections of lanterns, voices were heard, and she hurried to her friends. Near the tunnel entrance, Annika turned around once more, catching the glint of blind eyes, useless in the ocean's eternal darkness, in the dim light of the lantern. She waved goodbye, and in response, a gentle wave of ultrasound washed over her. They understood each other, allies who had lost a war, whose paths had now finally diverged.
Thanks for listening. See you soon, friends.